meeting is being recorded.
Good morning. Thanks for joining. We'll just give it a moment whilst people are coming into the webinar, and then we can get started. Fantastic. So whilst the last few people are coming through, I'll just kick off with a bit of an introduction and scene setting before we get into the real content around the webinar. So to start off, welcome. My name's James Carberry from Simply Energy, and for today's webinar, I'm joined by Tim Edmonds, who looks after the advisory team here at Simply, and also Daniel Pereira from Talley's group, of which Open Country Dairy are part of, and who is kindly joined us for this webinar and to talk through the journey that they've been on as part of their energy transition to date. So in terms of the format for the webinar today, we're going to kick off with some presentations from both Tim and Daniel. If you've got any questions about the presentation, please pop them into the Q&A during the presentations. And then once we've rounded out the initial presentation, we'll stop for some Q&A. So anything that's come through, we'll pick that up. And then we're going to have a bit of a deeper dive fireside chat with Daniel, just to talk through their journey, ask a few questions around how they've navigated their way through their transition. And again, there'll be an opportunity following that at the end for further questions. So if anything springs to mind as we're going through this, please do just pop your questions in the Q&A. And this is the fourth webinar in our Opportunities in Energy series. So we've previously done some presentations around New Zealand's energy transition. We did a deep dive on energy efficiency with ECA, and also a focus on the value of flexibility with Flex Forum. So post the webinar, we will send out a link to this recording, and there will also be access to the prior webinars if you've missed any of those and would like to jump in and follow some of that content. So that would be great. But without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Tim Edmonds on our side, who's going to take you through the first part of our presentation.
Thank you, James. So I'm sure a lot of you listening already know this, but I thought it's just good to cover to set the scene around process heat. So process heat makes up about a third of New Zealand's total energy use, 56%, which is still provided by fossil fuels. And our big goal is to get that down to zero by 2050, with coal boilers being first off the rank by 2037. And just want to highlight the word transition, as it's not a change or a switch. It is a transition. There's no way of doing it 100% now, and we definitely don't want to wait till 2049 to start doing it then. There's a lot of infrastructure and a lot of change that's going to happen between now and then. So our real focus at Simply Energy is to enable that pathway and help customers work through some opportunities now to get on that path. And it's been fantastic working with Daniel and Daniel's team at Talley's group, who are really brave to jump into that unknown and get moving on their transition. But I do want to put a positive note on this, as New Zealand, we're in a really good place to start on this. We've got a lot of biomass available, and we've also got a really renewable grid. So you can see on here, has been helped with all the rain we've had, but we've been 87% renewable for the last quarter. We're heading towards 95% renewable by 2030 for New Zealand's electricity. So we're in a really good place to provide renewable process heat. And thinking of that in the New Zealand context, is New Zealand feeds 35 to 40 million people globally, and in a really good position to provide low carbon produce to the rest of the world. But we do understand we need to remain competitive, as we want all that industry to stay in New Zealand, and there is a cost that we need to stay within to achieve that. So what we're going to work through is just some ways that we've been doing that for process heat, and we'll jump into Daniel's specific example. And then on here I've got as well, just as a bit of a sneak peek, the 3rd of August, electricity prices, this is about 3:30 in the afternoon, and we're down at 3 cents a megawatt hour. So yeah, equivalent would be 8.8 cents per gigajoule, or that would be buying coal at 15 cents a ton. So it's just showing how low the electricity price can get on the wholesale market, and it can be the lowest cost fuel, lowest cost energy available at times of the day. And yeah, obviously this is a really good example, but to give a bit of context, over the last year, yeah, for Daniel's site, it's been about 45% of the year has been in favourable pricing, in a favourable pricing place. So I'm just going to quickly jump into the 3 main areas that we do work on with process heat, and that's infrastructure, is bringing down that cost of what infrastructure is required, because obviously the big capital costs required here to get through that transition. Cost of delivery of getting that energy to site, and obviously we're focused on electrification, so that's around your network costs, and then how you bring down that cost of fuel. So jumping into the first one on infrastructure is typically on a large industrial site, you will get a N-1 supply, and what the N-1 means is there's resiliency built into the network. So what will typically get done is there'll be 2 sets of power lines coming to the site, 2 sets of transformers, 2 sets of switchgear, and what that enables is maintenance to be done without the site ever losing power, which makes sense because no one wants to shut down their processes. But this does cost a lot to have, you know, all that infrastructure available and not always being utilised. So we've found there is significant savings by using your existing assets on site to create that resiliency rather than building it into the grid. So if you've got an existing boiler on site, you can leave that boiler there, already paid for it, and use that as your resiliency. So when those maintenance days do come up, and you know, the 1 or 2 days a year the power has to be shut off to do maintenance on the lines, as you can rely back on that thermal boiler. And this is really about making projects economic to go ahead rather than just stopping because the numbers don't stack up. Another one is looking at what we can do with your existing capacity. So this is looking at what a partial transition, quite often a full transition. If you've got a 10 or 20 megawatt coal boiler and you're looking to fully electrify that, the upgrades in the network might be cost prohibitive. So it's looking at what available capacity might be in your local substation and then utilizing that, or what capacity you've already got. So you might be able to get a 20 or 30% of your process heat onto renewable energy, and then look at doing the rest in the future when that does become economic. So this is one that we've found has been a really great way of getting people on the journey and getting started, making some CO2 savings now and getting underway. And here's the exciting one we're going to really dive in today, and this is the price response. So I'll hand this over to you, Daniel, to talk through.
Awesome, thank you, Tim. Yeah, so here's a look at how it works in practice. So a bit of background is that the Open Country Aurora site has 2 high pressure coal boilers and 1 13 megawatt electrode boiler used as a peaking boiler. For the majority of the season, that 13 megawatt electrode boiler is used kind of as a low to 3 to 4 megawatts, and there's potential to ramp it up to the full 13, but that is cost prohibitive. So what we've done was simply is we've worked on this flexible dispatch structure, looking at the spot market and how we can get more out of that boiler when it is economic. We've set a trigger price, which is the red line on the graph there. So the trigger price is either equal to or less than the cost to generate steam from coal. So we know when the spot price is less than that trigger price, it's cheaper to generate steam with electricity. We'll move we'll move steam from our coal boilers to our electrode boiler and reduce coal consumption and yeah, help decarbonize site. Just Tim, back to you.
Cool. Thanks, Daniel. So that's the way we've been doing it for Daniel's site. There is also an opportunity to look at it the other way around of turning off when pricing is really high. So if you do have a really good price with your retailer and you're happy to run along on electricity, and this is when you're getting more towards that 100% transition, is by either having some thermal storage or again an existing thermal asset, is turning off during those extreme peaks, because obviously your retailer will still be exposed to those really high prices, so there's value there to be shared and turning off and avoiding those big peaks, and it's a good good for New Zealand as a whole, which I'll jump into now, around how our generation works. So obviously it is a price driven market, but there is a direct correlation. So if you look at here, this is the average day where the price comes up in the morning, there can be a dip in the afternoon and then peaks up in the evening. As the grid emissions do a very similar thing, as when the demand's high, is when the the gas generation and that sort of thing is having to be brought on. So there is a real benefit in managing to that wholesale MAC price in terms of what your grid emissions will be. So if you can reduce your load during those peak times, we found you can actually have up to about a 30% reduction in your grid-related CO2 emissions. Obviously, this will become less as the grid becomes more renewable. But from a starting point, is by responding to those prices, you're reducing those high peaks and that reliance on fossil fuel back generation. Another one I just wanted to cover off quickly, which really helps these projects come along, is the frequency response. Transpower have a market where if you've got a large industrial load that you can turn off very quickly, it covers that risk of if something happens in the grid and some generation trips off, they can drop that large industrial load for a minute, and then that gives time for new generation to come on. And you can get paid for having that allowance there. So there's a revenue stream there for large industrial loads that helps offset your electricity cost to provide a short fill in until that generation picks it back up again. And these events typically happen once or twice a year. It's not a regular thing, but they do need that resiliency in there. So it's another great way just to help offset these costs. And just want to jump off. I know we're really focusing on process heat, but a lot of these concepts can be applied to data centers, to wastewater treatment, swimming pools. It's not limited to just process heat, but that's obviously our focus today. And I'll hand it back to you, James.
Fantastic, thanks, Tim. So yeah, we're going to transfer over to Daniel now, just to provide some further insights around Open Country's journey and the transition and how that's been working. So yeah, Daniel, over to you, please.
Thanks, James. Yeah, so before this flexible dispatch structure, around 85% of process heat on site came from the coal boilers, with the remaining 15% coming out of that 13 megawatt electro boiler. So knowing that we had extra capacity in that electro boiler, we worked simply to see how we could get the most out of the existing assets on site. And the answer was demand flexibility into the operation. So next slide, please, Tim. With flexibility, and last year was a really good year for it. Tim touched on how good the spot prices were. We've managed to double utilization of that electro boiler, going from around 25 megawatt hours per annum, 25 gigawatt hours per annum, sorry, in the baseline year, to almost 50 gigawatt hours since the flexible dispatch structure was installed. Next slide, please. Cool. And here's what it actually looks like. So a lot to soak in, but we'll step through it. So the top graph shows the load on each of our boilers. So light blue is coal boiler 1, orange is coal boiler 2, and green is the electrode boiler. The graph in the middle shows the spot price of electricity in 30-minute intervals, and the graph at the bottom shows the load on the electrode boiler. So looking at peak load of around 13 megawatts on that boiler, and it goes down to about 3 megawatts. So you'll see when the spot price is good and it's low, we're making the most out of that 13 megawatt boiler, running it at 13 megawatts. Around 2 p.m. on that day, the price peaked, so we reduced load, moved back from coal. And when the price settled around kind of 4 to 5 p.m. that day, we've moved the load back to electricity. And yeah, you can see the same at the next day at 8 a.m. Cool. Thanks, Tim. So just to summarize that and the wins that we've been able to take out of this. So yeah, we touched on doubling utilization of that electrode boiler. That's enabled us to save around 6,000 tons of coal in that first season, reduce site's carbon emissions by over 10,000 tons of CO2 per annum, and yeah, just made transitioning that site economic and enabled us to do it with our existing assets in a cost-effective manner. Just
Fantastic. Thanks, Daniel. We wanted to make the most of this session for kind of Q&A and anything that people might want to ask. So we have had one question come in before we go to the fireside chat. So this is from Adam Dyson, who's just asking about the regarding the fuel cost slides. Is the spot price a dynamic input from the grid or some kind of prediction? So Tim, it's probably a good one for you to talk to here around how we actually control the boiler at the OCD site.
Thanks, James. Yeah, really good question, Adam. It's a bit of both. There is a 4-hour forecast that Transpower put out, and that's what we're monitoring to give a bit of prediction on how we're going to operate. And we do have the ability then to, if depending on the processing, we may want to minimize those switches. So we might be looking for 2 or 3 hour low price periods rather than just a half hour. So we've got the ability to do that. Looking at that forward forecast, the pricing is set per half hour time period. So for that half hour time period, the price will settle and it will be for that. So there is, it is set down to, we're obviously not going to be changing it every 5 minutes as we are looking at operating in half hour time periods. During those time periods, there are some prices. There's a new system that's just come in since November called real-time pricing. So there is, during those periods, an update on how that price is tracking, which we're doing some analytics on the background on, just to make sure that it is operating and we're seeing as expected, so we can make changes or recommendations on how it's operated to make sure that we're maximising it for open country dairy.
Thanks, Tim. We've had another question come in from Jason, just asking about, for the instant turning off of large equipment, how big in kilowatts are we talking for this to be effective? So I assume there's probably a question there, Jason, around, is there a minimum size that we're targeting here? So we can talk a little bit to that. When we look at emissions reduction and participation in the reserves market that Tim flagged, we're typically looking at a few hundred kilowatts upwards for the economics to start stacking up for flexible load within that specific market. But in this case, obviously, we're shifting multiple megawatts of load in terms of the savings that are flowing through. But Tim, anything to add in relation to the size there, or any wider impacts as well when you start turning much bigger loads off?
No, that really covers it, James. Is at the moment, obviously, open country, we're looking at about 13 megawatts that we're turning on and off. We can make this work on anything bigger than 1, but obviously there's ways we can look at it. And also there is shaped potentially on your retail price for those smaller loads to be able to move in a more programmed way if this doesn't stack up. So there is ways you can scale this down to smaller loads.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tim. A great question's come in from Carolina around checking forecast error. So do you backtest forward-looking prices versus final prices? And what is the current forecast error? So this is quite a live space for us right now, Carolina, as we look to optimize. But yeah, Tim, could you provide a bit more flavor, please, to that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's yeah, it's something that we're watching very closely. Currently we get about a 5 to 6% error in the final slot prices settling higher than we were expecting. But as we are building some more analytics into that, into the real-time pricing that's coming out to make sure that the forecasted load in New Zealand is tracking, so the pricing's matching up, then we're hoping to improve on that. So yeah, there absolutely is a little bit of an error in there, but we're finding that the benefits are far outweighing those couple of times that it is missing.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Glenn Johnson's asked, are there any network restrictions for turning on the electro boiler? Daniel, I don't know if that's one you can feed into, or Tim, do you want to pick that one up?
You comfortable asking that one, Daniel? Or
Yeah, I'll go for it. Yeah, we haven't had any restrictions in the last year of using that boiler. I guess for us, we're not ramping it up from 0 to 100. Most of the time it's got a base load and it's just making up for the additional capacity in there. In site already had capacity for the boiler, enough for site plus the boiler, so we could run the whole site and the boiler at peak all year, regardless.
Thanks, Daniel. And yeah, no, it's a good question around this, where you're ultimately optimizing within your current site capacity. But it's something that we're certainly seeing with more and more conversations on the customer side of these step changes in capacity requirements, and how do you manage that, both from a cost of installation, but then the ongoing supply of that. So yeah, definitely an interesting challenge as electrification is increasing around the country. We've got a question in from Rick Wellington as well, just asking about spot pricing during a dry year. So again, another really good question. So how much more can electricity be during a dry year if consumption remained the same? So Tim, over to you for that one.
I'd hate to give you, I can't really give you a number, but it is significantly more during that dry year. But that's where this type of system, we believe, can really can work well, and biomass and electricity can work well in the future, it can actually provide some dry year cover. So we can significantly reduce those energy costs if we have some stored fuel there, and then during those dry year, when those lake levels are low, rather than burning coal up at Huntly to cover the dry year gap, as we're utilising it at a much higher efficiency around the country, and using it directly for process heat. So we do think this is a really good system to help with the New Zealand's dry year problem.
Brilliant, thanks Tim. We're going to take one more question from the floor, and then we'll go into the fireside chat with Daniel to learn a bit more about the journey that he's been on. So Tim, if you could stop sharing the slides, that would be great. But the final question before we jump into that is, what's the end game? And this is one from Johnny. What is the end game here post-transition? And do you see a scenario where flexing between two fuels, e.g. electric and biomass, is commonplace in industrial sites?
So fantastic question, Johnny. Absolutely. It's the great thing. What makes electricity expensive is storage. It's really hard to store, as it's best used when it's generated. And as we get more and more renewable generation, we think there's going to be a bit more volatility in the pricing, and there's a real opportunity to use electricity when it's low, and then if you've got a stored fuel, biomass, then you can utilize that. It really ultimately sets a cap on your energy price, as you know what the maximum is going to be, but you can utilize lower cost fuels when they are available, when it's lower. Obviously there's some capital cost and complication on how you integrate multiple boilers into a site and then dynamically manage that, but yeah, there is significantly energy cost savings to be made by having two fuel sources and having them compete against each other. And we all know competition is great for driving down prices.
So what you're saying, Tim, is it's not all one fuel or the other, but there's certainly value there if you've got effectively an insurance policy with multiple fuels.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, James.
Fantastic. Great. Well, no, thanks. Some really good questions in there, and certainly some things that we're still working through, like Tim flagged around how do we optimize, the forecasting pricing that we're using for the control methodology here. Very mindful that it is a forecast. It's not an exact science, but to Tim's point, that most, if we're getting an error of circa 5%, the value that we're getting on the upside when we are putting the signal through is certainly having a significant impact, both from a cost and a carbon perspective, which is fantastic to see. So, Daniel, if you don't mind, I'm really keen to dig a bit more into the journey that you've been on with the team at Open Country and now the work that you're doing across the wider Talley's group, because it really is an awesome story to tell, and I think it's great that we can get it out there and more people hear about it, and hopefully it inspires other changes that are happening at the moment across industry. So one of the big things with these sorts of projects is obviously winning kind of the hearts and minds across the organization to drive something forward, especially when you're testing something that is a new concept or a new approach. So how did you get people aligned across Open Country Dairy to get this project moving, and what were some of the challenges you faced?
Cheers, James. Yeah, I think early on, one of the big challenges is that in process heat and across all our different sites, we tend to speak a lot of different languages. So some of us are used to talking in tons, and some of us are used to talking in megawatt hours, some of us gigajoules. So there's really just learning kind of what the metric for electricity was and how that relates to site, how tons translate to megawatt hours, and what the savings could be. So yeah, in terms of flexibility, we had that boiler in for over a year. We knew how reliable it was, how easy it was to ramp up and ramp down. And with the flexible dispatch structure, it was just kind of getting aligned that we had nothing to lose. So in a good year, we'd use a lot more electricity and reduce our emissions. But in a bad year, we'd just go ahead as we would with our baseline electricity consumption. So yeah, that's what really sold it for us.
Did you have any members of the team early on that were, even from a technology perspective, against the idea of the electric boiler, happy to stick with what they know? Were there any strong voices coming through, either at a corporate office level or on the ground at the Aurora site?
Yeah, I think there was a bit of pushback in the early days, and it just comes down to protecting the cost of production for that site. So, generating heat from electricity was significantly more expensive than it is from coal now, but more so a few years ago. So there was pushback there, but kind of seeing it in practice, how easy it is to use, how low the maintenance costs and requirements are, and what we can get out of it with flexibility. A few heads have been turned, and it's good to see the same people sitting in workshops and telling the crowd that they didn't want an electrode boiler a few years ago, but now they're itching to get a few more electrode boilers onto that site.
That's awesome. So I guess actually having it on site and taking the approach that you've done, which was effectively putting the boiler in initially to support your kind of peak demand, has probably helped. So it hasn't been an all or nothing approach. And like you say, you've now got stakeholders, I understand, on site then that are, turned from kind of being quite noisy against it to really supporting. Is that the case?
Yep, that's it.
Brilliant. And then what's the kind of impact on this from what you've seen on the wider industry? Like, have you had a chance in other forums across the, the dairy industry and things that you've been involved in, Daniel, in terms of being able to share your story and the conversations that you've been having? What's that been like for your journey?
Yeah, I think a couple of years ago, you'd go to an energy conference or a RETA conference, and you'd have people with biomass hats on one side of the room and people with electricity hats on the other side of the room, and it felt like it had to be all or nothing. But yeah, we've really managed to demonstrate that to get us to decarbonize or help us. It's a step change process, and flexibility is a big part of that. So touch on that question from Johnny earlier, and at Open Country and the Talley's group, we see the Swiss Army knife approach as the way forward for us. So where it works and where capital isn't a constraint, we'd love to have two different fuel types, be it coal and electricity or long-term biomass and electricity to help there. So it's really changed how we perceive energy centers and what the plan is going forward.
Fantastic. And you mentioned there that dual fuel approach with ultimately moving towards biomass and electricity with the technology and the existing coal boilers that you have installed. is that a relatively straightforward process for kind of switch out of fuel? I understand that there are some modifications that need to be made, but is that part of your thinking as the transition moves further, that some of those existing assets could be utilized with a biomass fuel instead of coal?
Absolutely. Yeah, we've proven it at our open country Waharoa site where we've recently converted those boilers over from coal to wood pellet. And it'll be a similar plan long term for the Aotearoa site, if and when it does stack up to just use the existing assets in the best way possible.
Fantastic. And Daniel, you mentioned RETA conferences there, and I know there are many acronyms across the electricity industry. So for anyone on the call that maybe isn't aware, the RETA is the ECA program, the Regional Energy Transition Accelerator, and it's a fantastic piece of work that is looking at the transition options across New Zealand, but taking a real regional focus by looking at the current process heat demands in that region, and then running a number of scenarios, a fully biomass scenario and a fully electricity transition scenario, and then starting to think about what the blend of those two fuel transition options might be. But the reason that is a really helpful and worthwhile exercise is it really starts to show what electrical constraints you might have in a particular region, or even biomass supply constraints that you have in a particular region. So the organizations within those areas can make really informed decisions around what the right approach is. But I like the flag that you made, Daniel, around this starting off as a journey. And it almost felt, having been to a few of those conferences and sessions myself, that felt a bit like a boxing match where you've got kind of electricity in the red corner and biomass in the blue corner. And I think the discussions that have come out to it have been really healthy in saying, well, actually, let's not look at this with just a binary lens. Let's look at what the dual fuel transition looks like. So that's that's really useful to hear. What opportunities does this flexible setup now give you in the future, and what are the sorts of things that you're thinking about within Open Country, and equally around the wider Talley's group, around how this could be lifted and taken to other applications and other sites?
Yeah, so I guess we already touched on kind of the dual fuel approach going forward. It gives us confidence in energy security where it does work. And if you do have two fuels that you can flex between them, if you're not sure what your contract is going to look like after the contract term, then if you've got an insurance policy to fall on with another fuel. And like Tim said, in a dry year, it could work kind of in the opposite method to where it's working now. So if we did go down the path of putting a new big electro boiler in that site to completely replace coal, we'd still look into having some form of flexible structure. So if there is a dry year and a gentailer needs us to reduce load on the grid, we'd be able to move back to coal or biomass to help in grid decarbonisation. And again, what Tim touched on, it's more effective for us to use our boilers at 80% efficiency rather than have to increase load on Huntly at that 35% efficiency.
Yeah, that's Tim, it might be useful to bring you in a little bit to go a bit deeper there, and so we can understand that idea. So what you're saying, Daniel, is, you've got an efficiency of using coal at your site during a peak, and then equally, there's a different efficiency if Huntly is ramping up to meet an evening peak across the whole grid, and also mindful that there's a ramp up time associated with those really big units sitting within Huntly. So Tim, is there any other insights around that, around the difference there, and what analysis that you've been doing in your team?
No, you covered it really well there, James. It's how we transition as a country, I think, is quite important. And managing those peaks. There has been, to date, there's not been a huge increase in electricity volume go through, but there has been an increase in peaks, and those peaks are slowly getting higher and higher, which can be problematic because infrastructure has to be built to support those. And then that drives up the cost of electricity for everybody, really, because that cost needs to be covered. But if we can fill in those peaks and then better utilize what assets we do have, and manage around those, then really as a whole, we're going to be in a much better place, because we're creating better utilization of our generation. We're using that renewable energy when it is available, rather than having to rely on having base load there that we can pick up during those peak times.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim. There's going to be a couple more questions from my side, and then I'm certainly keen to reopen again to the floor. So if you do have any burning questions, please do pop them into the Q&A, or if anything springs to mind at the end, we will have some time to touch on them. But Daniel, back to yourself. If you had to give advice to other businesses that are starting out, or maybe are already, thick in the calculations here and working out what the best options might be for their process heat, what would that advice be?
Yeah, I guess you covered it well with the reader workshops, James, that it's been awesome to bring a lot of different kind of minds into the room and collaborate in that sense. So I guess my best piece of advice would be to just be open and as transparent as you can with your gentailers, your network providers. If you've got an eco account manager, consultants that you're working with, because the more you enable these people to help you, the quicker you're going to see results on site. So really need to understand energy use on your site, whether you do it yourself or get their help, and then communicate it back to them.
And how have you been when it comes down to kind of crunching the numbers effectively and the economics around this, and both carbon and cost savings? Is that something that you've been running on your side? Have you been working with others, consultants, advisors, to kind of come to the outputs there? What's been your approach to kind of really understand and take, as you say, an open view on this, rather than jumping to an early conclusion of what fuel might be best for your business? How has that process worked for you?
Yeah, I think the foundation for us was undertaking the ETA process with ECA, so the Energy Transition Accelerator. That helped us to kind of learn the language and the lingo when it comes to energy, and also understand what consumption looks like across a couple of our sites, where the key users are and where the opportunities are. But from there, we've had kind of the in-house resource with me to crunch the numbers and the finances ourselves. It is powerful to do it in-house and keep up with your invoices and your actual figures, but understand not everyone might have that resource. So there are parties that you can lean on. There are consultants, there are people like yourself. ECA's very helpful when it comes to providing resource. So yeah, the network's there. It's just knowing where to reach out.
Brilliant. Thanks, Daniel. Now, some really, really interesting insights there. And just while we're waiting for any questions that might come through on the floor, I just wanted to pick up on something that was mentioned earlier in the presentation that's really interesting. Is it was a slide, Tim, that you put up around showing the real swings that you can get around both carbon and obviously cost in the grid. But you mentioned the figure of circa 45% of the year currently. It's looking positive, Daniel, for you to be running the boiler down at Aurora when the electricity price is positive. There's a strike price there that you mentioned around coal. And obviously, I imagine that's linked to the purchase price of coal, but also accounting for carbon cost as well. So, Daniel, do you see that as time goes on, certainly with a changing carbon price, that ceiling will slowly get lifted then in terms of what that strike price is for when you can run the electricity versus coal?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, the costs of coal ties into it, transport costs, fuel adjustment factor, and carbon price being the heaviest at the moment. But it's also your boiler efficiencies and the maintenance on those boilers. So as the boilers get older and less efficient, then that's going to increase the strike price. So yeah, it is a constantly moving line, and yeah, one that's quite easy to reevaluate.
Brilliant. Thanks, Daniel. Hey, we've got a question that's come through, probably good actually to put it to you both, Tim and Daniel. So Lisa's asking, how difficult is it to integrate flexibility into operations? Let's go to you first, Daniel, for the kind of the OCD perspective, and then Tim, if there's any other insights on top of that.
Cool. I guess for us, we've handed most of the hard work over to site, and the site manager and the maintenance manager to really work in with the team at Simply to show what our operations look like, what the risk is, how much heat we need, and when we need it. And Simply's really taken the reins from them. So yeah, credit to the site in that sense. And I guess, Tim, you can talk about your experience with site and what you've done to make it work.
Yeah, so thanks, Daniel. There was a bit of work of integrating it into the control system, but nothing too hard to overcome there. And obviously we want to make sure that's secure and very reliable. But we're really lucky that James and his team have had been running our hubs for quite some time, with the numerous programs that we have running. So it's quite a robust system. And there is some nuances, I guess, around minimum runs on boilers and that sort of thing that we've been working on to make sure that the system runs smoothly. But overall, it went really well on this site as integrating it and having a really proactive team at Open Country, wanting to move forward on this. There was nothing too challenging that we had to overcome.
Fantastic. Are you able to shed some light, Tim, on, you mentioned the minimum run times there, if you're jumping between the two fuel sources from both an electric boiler and a coal boiler perspective, but what's the position that you're currently landing on in terms of run times, and is there a ramp up for either of those steam generation systems?
There is. It is, we've been surprised at how quick that ramp up and ramp down is. So we did initially start running on 2-hour minimum periods. So we'd only be switching if there was a forecasted 2-hour drop, but we've actually been able to bring that down now to half an hour. So each half-hour time period, we're able to have a responsive, and that response is a significant change in volumes on that electricity piece. So we can have an effect on going by half-hour pricing. But we do have the system in there to extend it out if needed. So we're minimising that switching throughout the day. Brilliant.
Thanks, Tim. Question in from Rick, which is a good one, kind of taking a bit of a bigger view at the electricity system as a whole in New Zealand. So Rick has asked or stated there seems to be a lot of consented solar and wind farms from generators and also independent parties. I'd probably add to that. There's certainly a lot of interest here. If electrical demand increases, on average, how long do these types of generations, so both solar and wind, typically take to build? So Tim, I'll put that to you.
I can't give a really good answer on that one, to be honest. Rick, it's not my area expertise on how long it takes to build, but there is a lot in the pipeline. There's a lot of solar projects that have been consented and wind projects that have been consented. So there is a really good pipeline of renewable generation already underway. Obviously this is really big stuff, so it does take a while to build. But on the other side, it also takes a while to implement these projects. And this is where ECA have been doing an amazing job at creating a bit of a forecasted demand of what process heat's out there and which way they might go. So everyone's sitting in a very educated position of what the future's looking like.
Yeah, I can probably throw a couple of things in there, Rick. Just on the solar side, obviously a solar farm is going to be slightly quicker than a wind farm to bring to fruition. And some of the target dates, obviously there's a consenting process to go through as well, but you can, if things are moving really quickly on the solar side, see things coming online in 2 to 3 years. Wind certainly a bit longer as part of the consenting process and the visual impact. But again, it ties in interestingly to the flexibility piece here, because with a lot of that consented solar coming on board, fantastic for lowering the cost of supplied electricity when it's generating, so the middle of the day, and certainly higher yields in summer, as you'd expect. But equally, you've still got that issue around peaks, certainly in the winter as well. So if we are going into a winter peak, and obviously we don't have the solar generation flowing through, we're going to get that constraint, and obviously that flows through then to what the electricity price will be at that time. So the flexibility again becomes even more important. If you can have some level of thermal storage or switch between the thermal steam generation boilers, then that really helps to manage that risk. And Daniel, I imagine that's the kind of thing that you're probably thinking about as you look at other projects across the Talley's group of that ongoing kind of risk management and exposure to fuel pricing. Brilliant. I'll give a moment for any other questions that might come through, but looks like we've got another one from Glenn Johnson. So it says, would simply look to buy from solar farms at a fixed price or only spot minus a fee? That's a good question. So in terms of that approach, there is a standard buyback rate that works on both of those models. So typically we're part of the wider contact group. Typically at a residential level, there's a fixed buyback rate, but we do have some arrangements with commercial customers where we do purchase back at spot minus a fee. So again, that can be an interesting model to look at, especially again if you've got high spot pricing. So as you've flagged, spot minus a fee could be quite lucrative if you've got some level of storage. So we do have some customers that have both batteries and solar installed with some interesting smart controls where they're looking at how they can benefit from utilizing their solar when electricity pricing is high, or even feeding back in if they've got some level of storage. The interesting thing with batteries, without getting into too much of a discussion there, is you do need to look at multiple revenue streams and what's known as kind of value stacking to make the commercials work in that space. But it's certainly improving, and it will improve as the cost of lithium-ion batteries comes down. We've got a question in from Russell saying, longest time to build a consented project appears to be the gentailers waiting for the on-sale price to be high enough so as to keep profits up and protect against excess generation dropping the on-sale prices. So it's a good point here. Some wind has been consented for years, yet not built. Yeah, there's quite an interesting one to talk to there. Tim, anything you can add? It's probably less of our focus on the generation side under Simply, but any thoughts from your perspective?
No. It's the only thing we can add in there really on the process heat side is obviously there is that really low pricing, and by having some loads there with some flexibility, as we know that can be picked up if we've got a flexibility system in place. So again, it is guaranteeing some load in the future when we get this in place to encourage that renewable energy to be built. Obviously there's a risk on both sides of overbuilding generation ahead of process heat and EVs coming in. So if we can start now and show some confidence on that transition, and then hopefully we can encourage more renewable energy build.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, the focus here is really around giving confidence that demand is there then for any of those new projects, whether that's one of the gentailers or an independent generator who's looking for things like PPAs or offtakes. So yeah, we're really looking at how you can effectively soak up some of the excess renewable generation that might be there when the demand is slightly lower. And interestingly, if you look at other jurisdictions outside of New Zealand, the likes of Australia, the UK has had huge growth as well of offshore wind. There's some of the problems that they're grappling with at the moment, and looking at solutions around how they soak up some of that excess generation. If you've got intermittency, it happened only a few days ago in the UK, which was really interesting. Got a question from Alex, so a few more coming through. What are the network charges and its implication on the minimal annual electricity volume in terms of consumption to make it financially work? So Daniel, do you want to feed in a little bit to that one?
Yep. Yeah, I guess when this project went live and was commissioned, we had a good handle and understanding on our network charges, in the sense that they were mostly fixed for that 13 megawatt boiler outside of the regional peaks for Southland. Going forward under the new TPM, we have a little bit of learning to do in this area, and that's something that we've been talking to Tim about. So Tim, I don't know if you want to add to that in terms of how we can get a better forecast of our price or our actual price for per GJ of delivered energy with the new TPM structure.
Not in the next 15 minutes, but yes, obviously OCD have that boiler running, so a lot of network cost is around that peak demand charge. So you can get a lower cost per megawatt hour of delivered energy if you're better utilizing your network assets. So there's a real advantage in there of, again, filling in those troughs rather than adding to the peaks in terms of bringing down that network cost, which ultimately, if you're getting more energy through that network, you can bring down your dollars per megawatt hour of delivered energy. So there's some real advantages there. Obviously, with the add-in of all the changes in the TPM, the transmission pricing methodology, which gets passed through from Transpower to the network, and then the network does a direct pass through to its customers. There's some changes on how that's calculated, and there is some peak and some volume components to that, which we're working on, and how that impacts this. But that's really just adding to that delivery, that energy price, and then changing where you set that strike value to make sure that we've got
Fantastic.
everything covered.
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to take 2 more questions that have come through before we round out. And thanks once again for all these questions. Some really good points being made. An interesting one from Graham asking, is there a chance of the spot price going negative when there is excess renewable generation? So I can pick this one up. We're certainly seeing this outside of New Zealand, the likes of Australia again and the UK. This is happening where you do get negative pricing. Currently in New Zealand, the spot price will bottom out at 0 and not go to negative pricing. So we don't have those same scenarios, but there's some really interesting dynamics that have been happening in those markets where it does go negative. So being in a scenario where you've got generation that is actually paying to put that and inject that generation into the grid. So currently we get the scenarios that Tim had alluded to earlier in the presentation, where you get extremely low pricing. So looking at a couple of cents per megawatt hour. And obviously then when you've got that flexibility, that can be really beneficial for the likes of open country dairy and others that can maximize that opportunity. So that's the current structure that we have in New Zealand. Final question before we round out today is one through from Mike. So any opportunities or modeling you've done on gas boilers? We've talked a lot about coal today and the transition to biomass and electricity, but yeah, what does the situation look like if you're looking at a gas transition, Tim?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. That's a really good question. Gas is harder than coal because obviously you don't have it's not as bad as the CO2 component isn't as high, so there's not as much an effect on the ETS. But we definitely see an opportunity here for the same system to be worked on with gas. Yeah, slightly different around how you'd manage that, but absolutely, there's a fantastic opportunity there to do again a partial transition of leaving your gas boiler there and your assets there, and then adding in a portion of electricity. And using that when it works, and then we see our total energy cost come down.
Brilliant. So just to clarify there, Tim, the carbon content obviously is lower from gas than coal, so that has an impact on the carbon pricing. When it comes to the fuel cost currently, where's that sitting between coal and gas in terms of pricing as well, because that's equally a factor?
It's more it's the ramp up, I guess, as the ETS forecast goes up, there's going to be a much steeper rise on coal compared to gas. So the gas won't go up as quickly. So when you're looking at these over 10, 15 years, there's less of a gain on the gas than there will be on coal, because obviously we want to look at what the long-term net present value of these projects are. So that's not as attractive on gas, but we can definitely help in those situations, and again make some differences now. Coal is still by far the lowest cost fuel, but there's more advantages going forward as that CO2 component comes up. So it's just working through those benefits.
Thanks, Tim. Brilliant. So we'll round that out for today. I just want to say another big thank you to Daniel for joining this webinar and sharing the story. It's always really great to be able to work through an actual live example and see what's happening out there alongside some other fantastic work that's happening as part of the transition in New Zealand. So thank you once again, Daniel. Really appreciate your time and the insights. And looking forward to seeing the next stages in the Talley's group journey and what OCD do next. And thanks everyone for joining in and for putting the questions through. Some really, really good questions there for us to get into the details. So thank you once again. We will share the recording of this webinar afterwards. And equally, if you've got any questions or anything hasn't made sense, or you want to have a deeper conversation, we've got plenty of energy nerds here at Simply, and I'm sure Daniel will be happy to talk directly as well around their story for anyone else that's looking for further insight. So thanks again. We'll round out there for today, and all the best. Thank you.